Hello, and thank you very much for coming along again this evening. This evening we're going to have a look at a very strange situation. The military has been taking the lead for a long time now on considering climate change. In fact, within government circles, it's no doubt the leader. In part, this has been because they've had to be concerned with it. You don't go out on a ship without looking at the weather forecasts, especially in hurricane season. And when you begin to see patterns in hurricane seasons, and in fact patterns in sea ice, you get pretty interested in changes, things that are different from where they used to be before. So there's quite a different focus in some of the military branches that's been very immediate and very pronounced on climate change. The U.S. military has actually taken the lead on climate change, but its relationship to the rest of the government is very interesting and needs to be explored. So we're going to look at the state, the military, and the global climate crisis, not only emphasizing the way the military has taken the lead, but asking what happens next with a commander-in-chief currently in the White House that doesn't understand or doesn't want to investigate climate change, and with a Congress that is equally ignorant. It has to be said the military got going even before the evidence with a very interesting series of simulations and scenario planning. When they don't quite know what's going to happen, as in war games, they play out different scenarios. And this is crucial. They actually commissioned a study back in 2003 by Peter Schwartz and Doug Randall entitled An Abrupt Climate Change Scenario and Its Implications for United States National Security. October 2003, keep this in mind. It was subtitled here, Imagining the Unthinkable, and said right clearly up front, the purpose of this report is to imagine the unthinkable, to push the boundaries of current research on climate change so we may better understand the potential implications on the United States national security. This was a hair-raising report and kept under covers for a while, but it eventually leaked out, and it became so explosive that, in fact, it became a subtext of a film that was forthcoming the following year called Day After Tomorrow, a science fiction film, but it came out roughly simultaneously and dramatized some of the major findings of Peter Schwartz's scenario. A few years later, in 2009, the news media finally caught up with it, and they started making reports on climate change to spark armed conflicts, ? Is it going to spark these things? Well, they started to ask the question in any case. But this kind of reporting was based on a report earlier again done by the military at the CNA, the Center for Naval Analysis. It's actually a very interesting group of former military people. In this case, retired General Army Zinni from the Anthony Zinni from the Army spearheaded this study and had people convened in the fall of 2006. The report came out in March of 2007, and it was very revealing. Take a look.
We are already seeing warming. We're seeing melting of glaciers. We're seeing the beginnings of sea level rise. We anticipate, or it is projected, that rainfall is going to change, maybe heavier, maybe in a drought situation. And all that is going to happen to some degree in the next decades. And so no matter where this debate goes on the science and the environment, we think that from a national security perspective, that we ought to that we as a nation and we as a military ought to study it just like we study all other risks.
In the fall of 2006, 11 senior retired military leaders came together to look at one key question. What could global climate change mean to the American military and to U.S. national security? Working with the CNA Corporation, a preeminent nonprofit military analysis center, these 3-star and 4-star admirals and generals pooled their worldwide expertise into a military advisory board and found that this one key question, the implications of climate change on national security, led to many more.
What kinds of missions would we face? What kinds of tasks would we get in the military? What kinds of events would occur out there that we see coming that we need to be prepared to do? Is our force structure, our training, our doctrine adequate for that? Do we need to make adjustments in the traditional ways militaries make adjustments in their doctrine, their organization, their training, their education, their resources? That's what we're saying we need to take a hard look at this point.
Well, there you go. Retired generals and admirals saying, listen, we have to take a hard look at this, publishing it in March of 2007. Later, 2.5 years later, the media picks it up, okay? And MSNBC puts this out as a news story as if they're the first to get hold of it. Take a look at their story based on the Zinni report.
Now we go to a place where it is not hard to imagine desperate nations going to war over a scarcity of environmental resources like water caused by climate change, as our own Jim Maceda reports in our series of reports we're calling the perfect storm. It's a scenario a lot of people are preparing for already just in case.
African peacekeepers face off with angry villagers. It's only a military exercise conducted by U.S. forces in the Horn of Africa. But this could be the future, the aftermath of an environmental disaster.
That is floods, that is huge famine problems, because they all result in movement of people.
Triggered by a new kind of enemy, climate change. So serious a threat that former CENTCOM Commander General Anthony Zinni co-wrote a report on global warming as the future spark for conflict.
Could cause tremendous humanitarian problems that the local government's not able to cope with or deal with, could result in peacekeeping, peace enforcement requirements.
Already, the Pentagon and NATO have factored in dozens of climate hotspots in the shaping of future missions.
We're trying to establish where we may think that will happen, how it will manifest itself, and what action we can do to try and prevent that.
One ticking bomb, Egypt's Nile Delta, the most fertile land in the Middle East and home to some 50 million Egyptians. But the delta is under attack by coastal waters predicted to rise 3 feet in as few as 3 decades. If the sea comes to us here, life will completely end, says this farmer.
This is salt.
Dr. Mamdouh Hamza, an Egyptian engineer, compares this threat to Egypt's wars with Israel.
We should view exactly the invasion of nature to our delta as the invasion of any army to our land.
But Egypt is facing a double disaster. Even as its rich delta lands are flooded by rising seas, the Nile, its only source of fresh water, is receding dramatically.
As high temperatures and evaporation decrease water flow, upstream neighbors like Sudan and Ethiopia are diverting the river, even damming up the Nile for their own needs. The result, according to a World Bank study, water availability here will be cut in half by 2040. Egypt calls it a cause for war. It's one that could involve these U.S. and African troops.
Perhaps keeping populations apart from each other. It's certainly going to be the case that countries are going to try to keep out the climate refugees.
Across continents, climate impacts are looming. The peace group Alert International warns that almost 3 billion people are at risk from environmental wars.
Okay, 3 billion people at risk of environmental wars. This is being told to us in 2009, December 2009, 2.5 years after Zinni's report, March 2007. Notice what else happened, though, in 2007. In particular, the Chief of Naval Operations changed. The CNO is the highest-ranking naval officer, member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he takes over in September of 2007, shortly after the March report from the CNA on national security and the threat of climate change. As head of the Navy, he basically began to take this very, very seriously. He had had experience, after all. He was commander of the United States Fleet Forces all over the world prior to this. And then he served as the 31st commander of the United States Pacific Fleet. So he'd had fleet experience in both oceans and knew that they were up against some kind of change. 2008 turned out to be one of the record melt seasons of the global ice that was surface ice around the Arctic, and he was getting these reports from his captains and admirals. And he turned then to an admiral, a rear admiral under his control and command, a fellow named David Titley. Very interesting. They started doing TED Talks in the Pentagon. Not very often do people do TED Talks in the Pentagon.
Thank you so much for having me here today. I really appreciate this opportunity. Normally, I'd start in with a whole bunch of statistics about how the Arctic is changing, how the weather is changing, our sea level, and what the Navy's going to do about it. I'm actually going to do something just a little bit different today. I'm going to tell you a story about how I ended up where I am today, and also how I've kind of gone on a journey here from being a pretty hardcore skeptic about climate change to one who believes this is one of the preeminent challenges of our century today.
Okay, a journey from being a hardcore skeptic to one who believes that this is the preeminent challenge of our day. It was Admiral David Titley who took this to the public and, when he retired, became an extraordinary public spokesman for the military, looking at things like what? Well, you'd expect from his background, sea level and the ports.
The climate is changing, and the U.S. military is on the front lines. Former military leaders, top brass, are increasingly sounding the alert that climate change is a direct national security threat to the United States. The clearest threat? Naval installations, other facilities on the water's edge, including the naval base at Norfolk, Virginia, the world's largest, at risk of being underwater as sea levels rise over the next 100 years. And that's just the beginning. Climate change is changing the planet, and that means it's changing the threats that we're going to ask the military to deal with. Can the military help us innovate our way out of this problem, or do we just need them to help sound the alert to politicians?
Now that's pretty interesting. Do we need the military to help sound the alert to politicians? Now you recall that in the American system, politicians control the military, right? The military is being asked, the question is being asked, if the ports are going underwater here, what good is a naval base underwater? Norfolk, Virginia is regularly underwater at high tide. What good is that naval base, the largest in the world, if it's underwater? Can the military get the politicians to pay attention? Well, they started, again, publishing very contemporary things. This is in 2016, looking at what? Sea level rise and the U.S. military's mission. They don't get into the debates about the science. They look at the data. And just in a regular storm, not a hurricane, but a regular storm, the docks are overspilled here in Norfolk, Virginia, the largest naval base in the world. They started making the links public.
Climate change, energy security, and economic stability are inextricably linked. Climate change will contribute to food and water scarcity, will increase the spread of disease, and may spur or exacerbate mass migration.
Who do you suppose said that? Not a pundit, not a politician, the Pentagon.
These war games at Fort Irwin, California provide realistic training to keep our soldiers safe. The purpose of the Pentagon's Quadrennial Defense Review, the QDR, is to keep the nation safe. The review covers military strategies for an uncertain world. The Pentagon has to think long-term and be ready for all contingencies. The 2010 QDR was the first time that those contingencies included climate change. Rear Admiral David Titley is oceanographer of the Navy and contributed to the Defense Review.
Well, I think the QDR really talks about climate change in terms that really isn't for debate. And you take a look at the global temperatures, you take a look at sea level rise, you take a look at what the glaciers are doing, not just one or two glaciers, but really glaciers worldwide. And you add all of those up together. And that's one of the reasons we really believe that the climate is changing. So the observations tell us that. Physics tells us this as well.
What climate change means for key global hotspots is less clear.
We understand the Earth is getting warmer. We understand the oceans are getting warmer. What we do not understand is exactly how that will affect things like strong storms, rainfall rates, rainfall distribution. So yes, climate change is a certainty, but what is it going to be like in specific regions of the world and when?
One area of particular concern to the Navy is sea level rise.
Sea level rise is going to be a long-term and very, very significant issue for the 21st century.
The QDR included an infrastructure vulnerability assessment that found that 153 naval installations are at significant risk from climatic stresses. From Pearl Harbor, Hawaii to Norfolk, Virginia, the bases and their nearby communities will have to adapt.
Even with 1 to 2 meters of sea level rise, which is very, very substantial, we have time. This is not a crisis, but it is certainly going to be a strategic challenge.
Globally, climate change is expected to mean more fires, floods, and famine. Nations may be destabilized. For the Pentagon, climate change is a threat multiplier.
A threat multiplier. Now that was first used as a phrase in 2010 in this quadrennial report, and they began to focus on this in the next four-year quadrennial report, 2014. The Undersecretary of Defense gave a public discussion of it, and since then there's been a whole series of other things. Since the 2014 QDR, there's been a whole center set up for climate and security, and they've come forward with a consensus project statement. A bipartisan group of 26 national security and military leaders released a statement in September of 2016. They then held a Climate National Security Forum with very distinguished people, including Admiral Titley. That forum was crucial, again, for its timing. Remember what was happening in the fall of 2016, and particularly in September, they issued a briefing book for a new administration. Didn't know which administration that would be, whether it was Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. Recommended policies and practices for addressing the security risks of a changing climate, published in September before the November elections. Then they started putting out podcasts, and you can get access to them online, including very current ones like Sea Level Rise and Security in South Carolina, Implications for Military and Civilian Communities, when, in August 2018, just before the recent hurricane. Hours of discussion about what needs to be done and what they need to do. Well, where does this leave us now? What will happen now under the current administration with its tragic misunderstanding of the climate crisis and its propensity to ignore the best available advice of the most senior scientists and military officials? The military has been warning us about climate threat to national security, but how is it being ordered to act by the current president? Well, we learn a lot every day in the news, including
Department of Health and Human Services is diverting up to $266 million from other programs to help pay for detaining the skyrocketing number of imprisoned children. Targeted programs include the National Cancer Institute, the Ryan White HIV/AIDS program, Head Start, the National Institutes of Health, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and other refugee support programs.
well, money's being diverted from other social services to imprison immigrant children. Further, there are disturbing signs that the White House doesn't understand what's going on globally.
Spain's foreign minister has revealed President Trump recently urged Spain to build a wall across the Saharan desert in Africa to stop the flow of asylum seekers from Africa. Spain, which does not control any land in the Saharan desert, pushed back on the idea. Trump then reportedly said, quote, "The Sahara border can't be bigger than our border with Mexico." In fact, the Sahara stretches for about 3,000 miles from Mauritania, an occupied Western Sahara on the Atlantic, to Sudan in the east. The U.S.-Mexico border is roughly 2,000 miles long.
Right. And the president is going to ask Spain, which has no territory in Africa, to build a wall across the Sahara. This is remarkable ignorance in public space here. Very embarrassing, not just embarrassing, it could get us into a lot of trouble. Our problem is that the militarization of climate change cannot work, as the military officials have been saying all along. They can't cope with the problems coming down the pike in military terms. There had better be political solutions and foresight in civil government to cope with the climate change. The militarization of climate change is even more disastrous when you look at the impact of the environmental costs of militarism. There are thousands now, in excess of 1,000 military bases around the world, each consuming resources and fossil fuels on a scale unparalleled by any other organization in the world. Problems we face cannot be solved by the institutions and people that created them. And it was a Republican president who pointed this out years ago, decades ago, in fact. The Pentagon has been, as in all military engagements, involved in the devastating ecosystem impacts of warfare. Oil is burned just to be released, as we remember from the Gulf Wars. Yet we have former political figures wanting to spend more and more on defense, which means more and more on petro-intensive destructive capacity. And we have a Republican Senate and House that is preventing.
Just a couple of days ago, in their debate over funding the military, a massive funding bill, the National Defense Authorization Bill, congressional Republicans successfully passed an amendment to that bill that would stop the military for preparing for one of the most threatening possible future events that it's going to have to deal with: climate change. Specifically, they said, none of the funds authorized to be appropriated or otherwise made available by this act, that National Defense Authorization Act, may be used to implement the U.S. Global Change Research Program National Climate Assessment, and they go on to list other sorts of national and international recognition that climate change is a problem, that it will be a problem, particularly when it comes to foreign conflicts and things like that.
Okay. The congressmen are telling the military they can't use their funds for that, and then they turn around and pass a record defense bill.
In news from Capitol Hill, the Senate has voted 93-7 to approve a $674 billion military budget bill. Every Democratic senator supported the bill. 6 Republicans and independent Senator Bernie Sanders opposed it.
Okay, Democrats and Republicans are passing bigger and bigger bills telling the military they can't use any of that money for climate change. And you have to ask, what happened to the international strategy planning in places like NATO? Well, actually, Trump shows up and slams the allies, insults them. And you got to ask yourself, people like this who are focusing on climate hotspots back in 2009 as part of the Great Britain's climate security effort, what's happening now? Is there now any transnational military planning on climate change? Well, this is why we need a new kind of citizen science alliance.